Now I have a problem. Which language use? I will invite Michael Marrus to join me. We want to recognize him, and he will present. We are at Holocaust Education Week, and he's the scholar in residence. Since everybody will participate to a series of events, and we started, a certain amount of us have started yesterday, everybody will hear about his bibliography, which is too long to mention. But I would like to just point out to one thing in his life. It may sound incredible today, but in the 50s, the 60s, even the 70s, Holocaust studies and research were considered as non-existent. When Hilberg thought of a subject, his professor, who was a Jew, said, well, don't speak about the Holocaust. No interest, nowhere, and it will not get you a position at the university. He couldn't publish his book. His book was rewarded as the best thesis, but Harvard refused to publish it. Princeton refused to publish it under an advice from Anna Arendt. Finally, a generous donor paid for the publication of Hilberg, major book. If I mention this time, is to put the background of what Michael Marrus did, and to underline the audacity of taking the subject that you took. In the environment, it was not only, ce n'était pas de l'audace, c'était de la témérité. You know, he must not have valued his career as a scholar by choosing such a subject which quite obviously couldn't open easily the door of academia in Canada or anywhere else. I think it's worth thinking of that situation nowadays when the Holocaust seems to be really so prevalent and so obvious, as Paul noticed this morning everywhere. So what I'd like to salute in you is your témérité, you know, as much as your incredible scholarship that is still, you were last year at the Alliance Française, and all those French still refer to Vichy and the Jews, et les Juifs, parce qu'ils parlent français. You know, and so that book remains alive, and it was such incredibly, probably very solitary work, even though you did it with a colleague, but surely in the academic environment, you must have been solitary and pursuing your own incredible insight of what historical research could bring at so many levels. Michael?
Eh bien, mesdames, messieurs, chers amis, cher Alain, je suis énormément touché par votre louage, Alain, et je dois ajouter que même avec vos exagérations, si prononcer. Je suis vraiment touché et reconnaissant par ce que vous avez dit. I do want to add something that in a way touches on my relations with everyone here, because Alain, much as I am sympathetic with what you said, I have to say that I've never felt that being involved in Holocaust study is a burden, is something that I have had to take on as a task. To the contrary. And one hopes in this field, one hopes that one does good in the world. But the truth is, none of us know for sure. But one thing is for sure, and it has to do with the people. I have worked with wonderful, wonderful colleagues, wonderful people, wonderful teachers. And you mentioned one, Raoul Hilbert, a difficult man, difficult. But what a wonderful guy. And no one knows this better than my close colleague Doris Bergen, who worked very closely with him. Was he difficult, Doris? You bet. Was he a wonderful exemplar? And may I say the same with you. But I've worked with many people here. And I want to underscore this. It is one of the wonderful benefits that we have from working in this field. It is international. We have close colleagues, close relationships, close partners with some absolutely wonderful people. And I think that also needs to be said. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I have been asked to speak to you, quote from the kind letter that I received from Ruth and Alain. I've asked to speak to you about my reflections on the challenges still facing us in the field of Holocaust education, remembrance, and research. And I took this task seriously, and I want to offer some thoughts that perhaps will provoke a discussion, rejoinders, pushing back, agreement, or whatever. I also hope that I speak with some authority, at least on the matter of research and education, at least post-secondary education. Please note the distinction. I can't really speak for primary and secondary school education, and I think it's important that people understand that this is an expertise, and we don't all necessarily share it because we teach in one level of Holocaust education. On Holocaust remembrance, I'm also on much less sure professional ground. And generally, I defer to the specialists in that field. Generally. But not quite. I would say that however the Holocaust is remembered, whether with events, arts, statuary, plaques, literature, film, commemorations, monuments, museums, exhibits, there is nothing more important than that that memory be consistent with the truth about the Holocaust, at least the truth as far as we can manage. By which I don't necessarily mean facts only, or all the facts that are known, but rather a respect for understanding that past in its context, and with a well-grounded acquaintance with the Holocaust, its origins, its course, its character, and its place in the history of its time. And it's actually that responsibility that I want to talk about this afternoon after saying just a few words about Holocaust education and research. Let me begin with the latter. In my book, The Holocaust in History, which I published in 1987, I argued that over the course of the last decades, the Holocaust indeed entered into general historical consciousness, at least in Western countries. And it was not always so. But as a result of that entry, Holocaust research is international, and it's absolutely outstanding in quality, quantity, and scholarly sophistication. There are now libraries on the subject. There are journals, monographs, encyclopedia, archival collections, films, conferences, symposia, fellowships, university chairs, programs, internet resources. None of these things existed before. And so I think we really can safely say that the Holocaust has entered into the historical consciousness, broadly speaking, as well as the general culture, and that by and large it's handled responsibly. Not always, but by and large it's handled responsibly. The contrast, as I said, with the 1950s or 1960s is extraordinary. The Holocaust then seldom appeared outside the Jewish realm, and so that contrast couldn't be more stark, and you gave a good example of it in the case of Raoul Hilberg. But the real problem, so far as teaching is concerned, is how much history of any kind people know. There is good reason to lament that people may not know, say, about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or about other events of the Holocaust. But the sad truth is, they are also unlikely to be familiar with, say, the Reformation, the French Revolution, Mussolini, Stalin. This is the real problem. The weakening of history and history teaching, and unfortunately, it's largely out of our own hands. But there is something that is within our capacity, and it's that I want to talk about, and I appreciate that here I am moving into somewhat controversial territory. Loosely, let us say this has to do with Holocaust remembrance, although that term is very complicated, too complicated to deal with very fully here. But I think that among the challenges that are still facing us, to quote the letter to me, this one is huge. And it's something we can probably, each in our own domain, do something about. For the truth is that there is lots of discourse on the Holocaust by lots of people. And I do not believe that this discourse always meets the test that all people knowledgeable about the subject should be concerned with. What do I mean by this test? Again, it is that Holocaust discourse be as true as we can possibly make it to the circumstances of the persecution and murder of European Jews by the Nazi regime and its supporters, involving a well-grounded understanding of the origins of the Holocaust, its course, its character, and its place in the history of its time. Now this is a very big subject, as well as, I acknowledge, being provocative, and all I can do is really to allude to it here. But bear with me, please, as I choose just one theme, although I think it's an important one theme of Holocaust remembrance, namely the discourse on the lessons of the Holocaust. Now, if you do a Google search for lessons of the Holocaust, do it sometime if you like, late at night, with Google, well, I'll tell you what it yielded for me. In 0.19 seconds, we all have that on our computers, you get 8,900,000 hits. 8,900,000. With so-called lessons of the Holocaust, referring to a whole host of subjects. Let me tell you the themes of some of the big ones. You know, Google has a way of getting the most important at the top, and then, 7,999,000 will be less weighty. But what do you get? Man's inhumanity to man. One person can make a difference. Dangers of conformity. Jewish women can hold the family together. Bullying in the schoolyard. It starts with words, but it ends with the Holocaust. Jews can only count on themselves. And the similar, it is essential that Jews have a state of their own. On the other hand, We must all be alert to violations of anyone's human rights. And its first cousin, we must all be alert to all violations of human rights. Or one that I like best, by the late I.F. Stone, if you treat people like things, it can end up in the gas chambers. Then there is a special category of rhetorically bracing semi-lessons that, at least to my ear, sound more like slogans, albeit somewhat noble admonitions, rather than carefully deduced conclusions from a study of the Holocaust. The most famous, of course, is "Never Again." But you have probably heard of others that come up again and again and again on the web. For example, "The Holocaust is unique in its genocidal singularity." If not now, when? If someone threatens to murder you, you should take that very seriously. We are each guardians of each other's destiny. The Holocaust did not begin with gas chambers, it began with words. Well, that comes up in both categories. Jews are like canaries in the coal mine. Indifference always means coming down on the side of the victimizers. There are some things too terrible to be believed, but not too terrible to have happened. And there are others, many, many, many others. Our former Minister of Justice, Erwin Kotler, has 5 lessons of the Holocaust, and this appears very often because he's given these in many, many speeches. The 5 are: importance of Holocaust remembrance, danger of state-sanctioned incitement to hatred and genocide. 3, dangers of silence, which is the duty to protect. 4, combating mass atrocity and the culture of impunity, that is the responsibility of bringing war criminals to justice. 5, what he calls the trahison d'éclair, complicity of the elites. And then sometimes, depending on which audience he addresses, Erwin has added a total of 2 or sometimes a few more. The duty to educate, number 6. Vulnerability of the powerless, number 7. And then there are implied lessons, one of the most egregious of which, wrongly attributed to Abba Eban, is a reference to Auschwitz borders. You heard about Auschwitz borders, mentioned from time to time in the Israeli Knesset. The idea that for Israel to retreat to the so-called Green Line of 1967 would expose Israel to a genocide on the order of the Nazis' most destructive death camp. Here's another, coming from 1983, a time of heightened Cold War tensions. It's from the American columnist George Will, who is writing in support of the then controversial United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Will saw the museum as teaching a distinctly Cold War set of lessons. I quote him, "The museum would teach Americans that the world was dangerous, a mind-opening reminder of the furies beyond our shores, an antidote to our innocence." That's George Will on Lessons of the Holocaust, 1983. You get my point. People do dip into the Holocaust, well-meaningly for the most part, although not always, in my view, to define all kinds of propositions as lessons, many of them quite different, and some of which are actually in opposition to others. And all of them are questionable in this context, in my opinion, and I'll elaborate. Moreover, I will add, and I read about this actually only yesterday, that this observation applies not only to observers like most of us here, but also sometimes even to survivors. Just consider 2 of the greatest writers of the Holocaust, perhaps the greatest, who emerged from the Inferno. I'm referring to the Italian Primo Levi and the Austrian Jean Améry. For Levi, talking about life such as it was in the camps, I quote him, "The lager was a university. It taught us to look around and to measure men." But Améry, in his characteristically bitter conclusion, says precisely the opposite. "We did not become wiser in Auschwitz. We perceived nothing that we would not have already been able to perceive on the outside. Not a bit of it Not a bit of it brought us practical guidance, unquote. Now let me be very clear. My quarrel is not necessarily with the legitimacy of any of these propositions. It's rather that these formulae do not depend upon the Holocaust for their veracity, nor are they necessarily true in every respect, nor should they need or depend upon the Holocaust as a source of authority, nor are they necessarily a guide to modern-day challenges, and nor do they necessarily follow from an understanding of the Holocaust that is undertaken by Holocaust historians. And finally, nor do they derive from what I think should be the first responsibility of Holocaust educators and researchers, to get it right. To me, at least, there's something quite wrong with this. There is a special responsibility of Holocaust educators, therefore, which is to be faithful to the subject and to the truth of the subject, or to get it right. Does this mean that we should abandon our view that Holocaust education is good for society? This is not what I think. But I do believe that studying the Holocaust does not raise different basic themes than one is likely to encounter in any major historical event. Whether the Renaissance, the Reformation, the French Revolution, imperialism, World War I, or whatever. With each of these, one grapples with issues of, say, public opinion, violence, infamy, cruelty, prejudice, hatred, heroism, selflessness, creativity, suffering, myth-making, dominance, leadership, subservience, or whatever. In my view, at least, the Holocaust teaches what any history teaches, only more so. That is, the extraordinary range of human experience and the sometimes baffling and extraordinary possibility both for good and evil. What is particular about the Holocaust, and note I use the word particular and not unique. What is particular about the Holocaust is the intensity, the concentration, the morally and emotionally compelling character of the material. After studying the Holocaust, I have the sense of having seen it all in the extraordinary range of human experience. Practically nothing anymore can surprise me. And I wonder if you don't feel the same way. And is this good for society? You bet it is. Thank you.
Oh, any question? The answer is here.
Yes, ma'am.
I don't have a question. I just want to say thank you for what you just said, which is very helpful in conveying that to people who do not understand it. And I'm sorry that more people don't hear that. It would be extremely helpful.
Question, Michael. I wanted to ask, why do you think this has come to be in this way? You know, because you ended at the end, and I think it's exactly true. When you teach a course on the First World War, or you teach a course on your topic, students never come and think they have to put a certain look on their face and have a certain attitude toward the course. In other words, the field has developed in a way that is particular, and one might even say unique, and there's an expectation that students and audience and people bring. And where has that come from? Has it come from somehow within the field? Has it come from outside the field? How did we get to the situation that we're describing?
Doris, what a difficult question. And let me say, someone who is on the front lines of this is here with us this afternoon, and that is Mira Goldfarb. We have an absolutely extraordinary Holocaust Education Week that is beginning. And what is one of the extraordinary things about it is that it surprises the organizers. I mean, Mira and I were talking about this. Lecture yesterday evening, Holy Blossom Temple. They turned people away. There were people in an overflow room. And I know that we are now revising our sense of the silence in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, but we can overdo that, still and all. It's extraordinary. The Holocaust is now everywhere. By the way, Alain, you mentioned France. You go to France now, you go into a bookstore, there will be a shelf of books on the Holocaust. I mean, what accounts for this transformation, not only here in Canada, United States, North America, France, Europe, wherever? What accounts for it? It is a puzzle. I think we should think about it. I have to say, and I know you and I have talked about this, and we agree on it, and I think many people feel similarly here. It's fantastic material.
Yeah.
I mean, you read a new book such as we can, let's say, on Oneg Shabbat in the Warsaw Ghetto. What a fantastic history book. I mean, the quality of the research and scholarship internationally is so outstanding that we find it's compelling for our students. I mean, most of us in this field can hardly keep quiet, you know, when it comes to the work that's being done. And happily, once a year, Mira showcases it for the general community, who similarly seems now to be drawn to it. But we don't fully understand this, Doris. At least I don't. And I think here's the issue. It's our job to try to ensure that it is done responsibly.
Michael, are there any areas of Holocaust research you think have not been given sufficient attention?
Well, I would say as soon as you mention one, it turns out that there are some very bright graduate students who have already figured it out. We may not be giving it appropriate attention, but they are. There is a group, for example, of young German historians who work on concentration camps. Who knew? I know because I sit on a committee of the Memorial de Shoah, and they come to us for their conference. They are international. They are doing innovative research. They don't always like the research that their professors did, and they are shooting away ahead, doing work that we will all read and admire in the years to come. And I am constantly amazed by how the field is renewing itself. At the University of Toronto, certainly, we are very hard-pressed, and my colleague Doris Bergen is very hard-pressed, to find the time to direct all of the theses that we have and the work that is being done. However, I'll say, just as a footnote, remarkably, and this maybe also is a sign about the field, they get jobs, and good jobs. Have you heard that recently in the academy? I don't know, maybe we're an exception, but it is the case with our students. So, you know, we have challenges, but I don't think they're the challenges that one hears so much in the public media. You know, people are forgetting the passing of the survivor generation. We're going to be without. Just take testimony. Holocaust testimony has become such a sophisticated art that to get into any kind of oral history now without finding out how Holocaust scholars have sorted out how to take testimony and the deep postmodernist implications of doing it one way or another way or whatever, if you don't do that, you're just not professionally, you know, up to speed. So, you know, the study of public opinion. When I was a graduate student, we studied public opinion. It was primitive. We looked at newspapers. Okay. All right, it's better than nothing. But now we have diaries and we have all kinds of records and I mean the work done, in particular, I think of our colleague René Poznanski, who worked on France, a book, a big book on la vie quotidienne en France pendant la Shoah. I'm not sure if that's the title, but in any event, about 800 pages, a weighty book. Is it deep? Is it important? Is it sophisticated? It will stand muster, I would say, to any kind of study of popular opinion. So, you know, it's a fantastic field. On the other hand, I have to say, you know, I get uneasy sometimes with these famous lessons of the Holocaust. Everyone has a lesson of the Holocaust. It's all over the map, and, well, you know now what I think about it. Yes, Frank.
Michael, thank you. It was wonderful. About 35 years ago, when I started teaching the Holocaust in high school, and around the same time as you were you know, working, I guess, on the Vichy book, the mantra arose, especially in the United States, that the raison d'etre for teaching the Holocaust was to create good citizens. That there was a moral imperative to teach the Holocaust. That there were moral lessons to be learned. That students, you know, would be exposed to this, and they would learn about about hatred. I mean, much later on about bullying I mean, that is still there, you know, as, you know, one hears this very much, and in fact, you know, there are organizations devoted to that, and I sit on the board of one of those organizations. But how would you respond, how would you have responded circa 1978, shall we say, to that kind of...
Okay, my own thinking was actually to go back a little bit earlier, and when I first got a sense that there was this effort being made. So, Frank, trust me, it was even before the 70s. I'm thinking of the 1960s when I was a graduate student at the University of California, and, well, needless to say, there would never be something called, you know, a university course in the history of the Holocaust. For sure not. On the other hand, we were beginning to read about it. Hannah Arendt was a major figure, and the entry point, I think, was not good citizenship, it was identity. And it was counterposed to black identity, which was very important at the time. James Baldwin and you know, other writers who were talking about the ruminations on the civil rights movement, and that led to identity, and then for Jewish identity, the Holocaust. And so I can, you know, Proust, very, very important. And Hannah Arendt, by the way, has a lot to say about Proust. So we're a long way from that. Then came Eichmann in Jerusalem. Adolf Eichmann, by the way, celebrating or commemorating the anniversary of the trial in Holocaust Education Week this year, and we are planning a major conference at the University of Toronto next autumn. By the way, a year from now, University of Toronto in collaboration with the German Historical Institute in Washington. The issue then posed about Jewish, the responsibility of Jewish leadership, and this was at a time of all sorts of intense criticism of leadership of all sorts, and so Hannah Arendt sort of fit into this. Where am I going with all this? I'm going in the following place. The focus on the Holocaust takes its color, I believe, from the issues that are important in society at any given moment. And what we take as the important and key questions were not the issues that were taken as important and key issues back, say, in the 1960s, and will not be the issues that people will take as important in 30 years from now. Time bound. still in all, we have to do as well as we can, and I don't think there's anything wrong with taking our cultural direction from the society in which we live. Everyone does this. But I think as long as we are aware that this process is subject to misuse, then I think we will be doing our job responsibly.
Question? Other question? In French? Oh, pardon.
I will never say
Non, allez-y.
non, mais c'est parce que j'en comprends ici. J'ai perdu mes illusions sur le sujet. Long time ago. I'm too old. No, I think just a common question. The gentleman spoke from, more like from secondary high school teaching, I
Yes.
guess. And I was wondering, aren't we living anyway in primary and secondary education with that very close association between history and citizenship education? And doesn't the Holocaust suffer in a way because every time you put together history and citizenship education, there's a danger that history be instrumentalized in moral lesson. I think we're living through that in many, many other subjects when you're speaking about school curriculum, this close association between history and citizenship education. And because the idea then is not so much that what you learn from history is skills, but it's more like moral lessons.
First of all, this is a very good point and a difficult question. Could I close by offering perhaps more of an aspiration and a hope than something that I think is necessarily true, but the quality of Holocaust research and study, I think, might well enable us in some manner to transcend the time bound, because the truth is, it's often said, the Holocaust is such a panorama, and the writing on it, I think, has now very effectively captured that huge panorama, that we should be able to reach into it just the way I can find a Jean Emery, just when someone is pounding us over the head about how much you learn from having been in a concentration camp, and Jean Emery is there with all of his authority to say, I learned nothing. Oh, okay. And so what do you do with these, with these class, So try that.
Okay. So what I'd like to do now is basically finish, seal the session, and thank you all. What I would suggest is for us to stay maybe a little bit more here, to chat between us, maybe ask a few questions that we didn't dare to ask directly to Michael or to others, and tell us more about transportation for the event of tonight.
Anybody who's looking for transportation for tonight, and anybody who is driving from here to the event, please come speak to me, and I'm going to try and arrange as many carpools as possible, and anyone else, I will deal with that as it comes up. And can I just ask anyone who received an award, if we can just have everybody pose for one quick picture for posterity's sake, holding the awards.
We want to thank.
I'm glad you can
Yeah.
Sorry.